Hello, everyone, and welcome into another episode of Careers on the Move, a podcast brought to you today by Cargomatic. I'm your host, Tyler Kern. Thanks so much for joining us here for this episode of the show, where each episode we talk to someone who's doing interesting, unique, fun things in the world of supply chain and logistics. And today is no exception. Today we're talking to Chelsea Heyward. She's the Director of Marketing and U.S. Relations at Eye Global. Chelsea, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me and for providing the platform.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled to dive into your story and to learn a little bit more about what you do at Eye Global. It sounds like you guys have a fantastic mission just from looking around on your website and reading a little bit more about you. But let's start off just learning a little bit more about your journey and how you ended up where you are with Eye Global as the Director of Marketing and U.S. Relations. Just give us a sense of, your background and where you came from.
So my background is in sports. I'm born and raised in LA, and how that led me here, just super long story short, is that a couple of the athletes that I work with wanted to impact the cosmetic and beauty industry, and sort of tapped me to help them in this space. And so, longer story or short story longer, I got my doctorate in organizational change and leadership, and the work that I focused on there was improving the effectiveness of athlete activism. So beyond raising awareness around social justice and racial equity issues, how are we impacting the systems that rooted these issues? And so that sort of brought me here. The work that I do in my sports world is about that impact and finding a deeper level of impact, which has contributed to here at Eye, where we're trying to focus on access, ownership, and quality for communities of color. And so I had a brief stint in the food industry just personally, which I think gave me more of the logistics and operations experience needed for this space beyond anything else in the rest of my roles. But through that, I've learned a ton. We've learned a ton through just working with our African farmers and suppliers. And then I think from an impact perspective, that ethical and empathetic approach to humanity has been what's separated us apart from other companies.
I suddenly feel super underqualified to talk to you about these things, but it's incredible the work that you're doing, and I'm excited to dive in and to learn more about it. So, tell us a little bit more about that mission for Eye Global and where it all started, where it came from, and how you fit into the overall picture of what you guys do.
Yeah, so just crazy timing, coincidentally enough. We sort of started unofficially having talks February 2020, recognizing that we were, even a little bit before we were fully on pause for the pandemic, that we were going to want to have a deeper impact in this space just because of how much Black individuals and individuals of color make up the ethnic and beauty hair care market versus how much are actually in ownership. And so we started having these conversations February to April-ish, and then obviously following the murder of George Floyd come May, became the world sort of opened itself to us and readied itself for us. And so what our main focus is basically one product at a time, trying to provide access and opportunities, again, to communities, but still producing a product that's full and high quality. And so from that, we want to make sure that from soil to soul, which is our tagline, we're working on that ethical approach that also is something that doesn't have to be necessarily a charity event by consumers or by corporations looking to source from us, and that understanding that impact can be financially sound.
It seems like a lot of times things that start the way that Eye started, it starts with kind of a realization, like a statistic or an understanding that, oh, this is how things are, and maybe things shouldn't be that way. Was there kind of an aha moment like that for you and for some of the other people involved in Eye, where you kind of saw the way that the world was working and thought, you know what, we can work to change that? Was there a kind of a moment like that, or was this a gradual kind of progressive realization of we can do something to help kind of change the way that the world operates in this way?
No, there was that stat, and I think it was just that African Americans represent 13% of the country, but 86% of the ethnic hair and beauty care market. And so recognizing that disparity on top of recognizing the minimal amount of representation at the senior levels in these positions, we thought that we could provide an opportunity, not necessarily to directly create a pathway forward for advancement, but at least within that 86% provide opportunities for advancement in whatever that meant to them. So from the community level, from our African farmers and suppliers, maybe that looks like programming to help them first gain literacy skills so that they can expand their career opportunities. From the sort of supplier perspective, I guess, going up that rung beyond farmers, making sure that they're being treated ethically. That was another several statistics fueled some of our work was all of the exploitation that we've been seeing in Africa across industries, and not necessarily within the hair and beauty care. While it is still starkly alarming, there's a lot more related to food and minerals and goods in that regard. And so recognizing that, then recognizing when we pulled the team together to talk about it, that we had people with access and influence in a variety of capacities that were needed. We knew someone who had relationships on the ground in Africa. We knew someone who had the impact level thinking. We knew someone who had the business eye to be able to piece together how this functioned fiscally, in addition to figuring out from all of our collective experiences what we could come together as a collective to then push forward our separate industries. And so I use this example all the time, but in architecture, for example, a lot of the inspiration and the facilitation of building design centers on what's going on in nature or what's going on in other spaces. And so taking that same approach and bringing together seemingly incongruent opportunities, we figured it would teach us things we didn't know we didn't know.
That's really fascinating, and it's really interesting to hear about the journey that you've all been on with this with what you're doing. And part of me wonders, running a business is challenging in its own right, and then running a business ethically and doing things the right way can present another set of challenges. While you're doing things the right way and in a good way, you have other places and other people who are cutting corners and that sort of thing. And so it feels like you have challenging aspects on multiple different fronts, and then tie into that the fact that you got started right before a pandemic and then kind of got up and running throughout the year of 2020, which was an unprecedented year for any of us, right? So it feels like you had to juggle and kind of balance a lot of different things that you wanted to do. How did you manage that, and what sorts of challenges kind of presented themselves from those three fronts that you were working against?
Yeah, you weren't going to add that COVID adversity, and I was, but I think the first part was recognizing how do we make this happen. So we have the vision, but how do we make it an executable business plan? And so that's when sort of our pillar, our business, our COO, our business-minded person was able to put together, devise a plan, help us facilitate market research to understand where the opportunities lies, where the opportunities lied, what products are available, then cross-referencing that with our own personal relationships and who we knew on the ground. So that was sort of the first step. But then we recognized that in doing a lot of this work, another pain point for brands and companies was the supply chain issue. And this was something we had started figuring out before COVID, which was drastically exacerbated and still exists today, really. I'm in LA, so just down from the Long Beach port, where we're having a ton of issues with supply because we don't have the truck drivers to take the containers off the ship, which is a whole other story. But in this whole journey, we've been faced with obstacle after obstacle, and I think that we've really just figured the path forward. And so in the supply chain issue, I think it's been really important developing those direct relationships again with our suppliers, but then in facilitating relationships also with the government officials sometimes needed for processing some of the paperwork. And again, from the perspective of getting our consumers product in a timely manner that's still of high quality, that we're still able to have a deep level community impact on.
You mentioned the disparity in terms of how much of the beauty market is made up of from the Black community and from people of color. How do you feel a responsibility at all to blaze a trail and kind of provide and to be a role model for people to show that there can be people in this line of work and in this business that do what you do? Do you feel a responsibility there at all, or do you feel that it's part of what you do and part of your role to help train the next generation of people who are going to come up behind you and continue on the work that you're doing?
I do, for two reasons, really. I think from the corporate social responsibility perspective, getting companies to recognize that making sense with an S and making sense with a C don't have to be mutually exclusive, that they can work in tandem. So like I was saying earlier, you can have a financially robust company that also does good and that also is ethical and that also doesn't skimp on the quality of care that they're providing across their supply chain. And so taking ownership of that supply chain is one thing that we wanted to shed a light on for communities of color, from the consumer facing perspective. And then in addition, on that consumer facing side, educating consumers who are, as we're making up the bulk of this audience, educating them on the quality of the products that they're receiving. So while quality is important for us, a lot of people aren't fully educated on what quality looks like. And so I think our flagship eye opener here has really been shea butter, in recognizing that most commercial shea butter is actually rancid by Shea Butter Institute's testing standards. And it's not something that's going to burn your skin off or that you're going to recognize, but that level of bacteria that people are putting on their face or all over their body or on their children is still not something that I feel like if you knew this information, would be willing to take on. And so educating our consumers in that regard has been sort of a twofold journey, both on what product quality is, how they can take ownership, and then on the corporate brand side, letting them know that they can be ethical, have impact, and make a difference in their community while still growing as a business.
You've mentioned that word educate a couple of different times. How much of your role as a marketer and being as the U.S. relations representative for Eye to Eye, how much of your job do you feel like is educating people on the current state of this market and products like what you just described?
It's a ton, and it's actually been phased. So we've been working through finding all this information out for ourselves. It's been a little bit of a learning curve on our end. Just again, recognizing that we sort of piecemeal together this team that had all of the opportunities aligned. And in doing so, as we got this education, then figuring out how to regurgitate it back out to where it made sense to people in a pretty digestible way. And so I think in that process, we've had to sort of phase how we're talking to companies behind the scenes, how we're talking to consumers sort of more directly. And then from a public facing perspective, as we're having these conversations and dialogues, attacking the issues there. And so we took a moment to pause on our social media channels as we had these conversations behind the scenes so that we could really gather input around all of the various perspectives in this industry, again, from consumer and corporate perspectives. And even so much, we had a Black Beauty brand webinar to help educate them on, of course, our approach and our mission, but what it looks like to scale in this industry and what it looks like to have products that are quality as well as clean, as well as affordable in all of those ways. Because I think from sort of the average listener, this sounds like the right thing to do. And so it seems like something that everyone should be doing, but that's not currently the case. And understanding how deregulated this industry is, there isn't the incentive. The companies that are at the forefront of these issues are really leading the charge. But for the bulk of companies, there isn't that incentive to do better. So we've had a ton of these behind the scenes conversations and then really tried to take that education and then give it to the general public. And now we're sort of getting ourselves back out there in the public sphere.
Yeah, you make a great point that sometimes things can seem so obvious when you explain it the way that you explain it that you think this is a no-brainer, right? But it's about creating that awareness, right? And creating that momentum, which it seems like it is a lot of what you're doing, utilizing education and getting the word out, I suppose, is that you have to create that momentum there for it to kind of become a widespread belief and a widespread understanding amongst people, right?
Right, for sure. I think, I guess in some of my other work, I'm a college professor. And so I'm always telling my students that words shape narratives, narratives shape belief systems, and eventually belief systems lead to action, which cement our legacy. And so from that framework, we understand that it first starts with the words. For a lot of how the beauty brand is marketed is based off of whoever has the biggest budget. And so when you hear certain products being put up on a pedestal, when you hear certain words, recognizing and identifying the difference in between what this means and what this actually shows up as in the real world. So, for example, the difference between organic versus natural. So, natural is naturally occurring, but organic is used without pesticides, and so on and so forth. But recognizing the language that people should be paying attention to, just as you would in the food industry, and getting consumers to read the label so that they understand what they're putting in their body. From an education perspective, for us, it's that same phase, reading the label so you know what you're putting on your body.
That's a great point. Absolutely. Yeah, I want to shift a little bit more just to talk about your day to day and what that looks like. So, what does a day in the life of Dr. Chelsea Howard look like? What just break that down for us. So, what's your role like on a day to day, and what are some of your regular responsibilities that you're taking part in?
Yeah, so in the eye to eye space, like I said, we're diving back into social here. So we've been strategizing for the last few weeks pretty heavily about how to grow those platforms. And now we're starting to sort of roll that out. We added a new member to our team, so excited to see her growth in that space as well. I think, again, from soil to soul, really working around impact. And so We were at Cosmoprof in Las Vegas a few weeks ago, and one of the individuals that had signed up to work with us for that event, we ended up bringing on full time to help with some of our marketing initiatives. And so having that, again, sort of direct relationship with people that we interact with wholeheartedly is important. And so outside of sort of the social stuff, we've been figuring out scale. And so how do we get strategy behind getting in front of more people to help, now that we have this messaging fine tuned and we have the market research to show just the differentiation between our products and why this messaging matters and what impact this could have on communities in the future. We're now working on the scale of that information. So that includes social media, that includes email outreach, and really just includes continuing to get in front of folks. So we'll be at Suppliers Day in New York here in a couple of weeks, actually.
That's awesome. That is awesome. So if there is someone out there, a young person, college student, high school student, someone like that, and they're listening and they're saying, "Man, what Chelsea is doing is incredible, and I really want to be a part of something along the same lines or something like that." You told us a little bit about your journey before. What would you recommend to people who say, "Okay, I want to make a difference. I notice this, whether it's disparity or statistic or something like that, that makes them say, I want to change the world in some way, the way that you're doing." What sorts of things would you recommend for them to do, whether it's education or taking action and getting involved at a young age? What sorts of steps would you recommend people take?
Probably first, recognizing what it is that motivates you. There are so many problems in the world. We don't have to have everyone solving them all. Focus on what you care about, because that's what you'll stay motivated and committed to, because a lot of these issues are for the long haul. When we talked about some of those projections, another one of the stats that stood out is that by 2053, African Americans are projected to have a negative net worth. And so what that means is that the amount of money we're supposed to have, or businesses tied to, and so on and so forth, would be below zero for African Americans as a collective population, which is a stark contrast to other information that we found, is that for the average white family, their net worth is around $150,000, and for Black families, it's $17,000. And so getting all of this information out there, taking it back to what the younger generation should be looking at is what motivates you. There's a ton of information about a ton of different things. If you find something that motivates you, once you've identified it, then step two is to get educated on it. And so recognizing within whatever industry you're on, whatever opportunities you're aligning yourselves with, learn about the organization, learn about the history of that space, learn about what people are saying is coming next, because that could, three, get you then an opportunity to work in that space, whether it's full-time, whether it's volunteering, whatever that looks like, but contributing either financially or your personal time or just your ability to raise awareness within your own sphere of influence becomes really important. But I think first, if you don't know what you are passionate about, you'll end up running in circles. And then, of course, get educated, because if you aren't, you could do more harm than good. And then apply the information you've learned to direct change the way that subject matter experts have outlined.
So how do you see eye to eye continuing to grow and move forward as you continue to build? Obviously, you've built throughout a pandemic. Your almost your entire life cycle up to this point has been in the midst of a global pandemic. What do you see for the future? What do you hope to see happen over the next 5 years?
Yeah, so of course, growing as a company is really important to us, because we have several plans to do. So while we're focusing right now on our impact in Africa, and of course our education and awareness in the States, we also want to have a deep level impact here. But again, through that phasing research that we've done, recognize that from a scalable perspective, we have to start smaller, not to bite off more than we can chew. And so bringing those opportunities, whether it's workforce development or financial inclusion or education or any other community products that would uplift, where we're able to build out our facilities or hopefully expanded offices, so that we can impact the communities that we're represented in, like literally geographically, is one space. And then I think also scaling to bring more awareness to Africa as a continent. There's a lot of misinformation spread about Africa, a lot of fear of Africa. And it is a beautiful country, a beautiful continent with beautiful countries inside of it, as well as very, very intelligent people. And by, again, that same 2050 sort of decade, is set to have one of the largest workforces in the world. And so recognizing the opportunity to information share as well as scale together, going full circle back to our thought process and coming together, is when we can merge dissimilar spaces, we can advance society as a whole.
That's a great point, and I think you're absolutely right about misconceptions. What are some of the common misconceptions about Africa that you've run into and that you've heard throughout your career, and maybe correct some for the audience if people maybe either aren't aware or have heard some of the same things and just don't know.
I think there's generally just a large fear of Africa. There's a lot of fear in how what's been presented. So I think this sort of putting on my academic hat, I think the reason why this happens is as human beings, we need to survive. So a lot of what drives us is either fear or love to procreate or keep ourselves safe. And in that fear space, in that fear capacity, a lot of what's happened in the media with clickbait and with shortened clips that'll get you to go to whatever website for the longer story. We've had to condense headlines and stories so much so that we're missing the main point. And for Africa, what happens and why some of this content goes viral is that fear-based approach. And so you have the over publication of things like different terrorists groups. You have, of course, the commercials about feeding hungry children. There are hungry homeless children all over the world that need help, not just in Africa. And then, of course, as bigger corporations and companies come in and bleed Africa dry of resources, there's that thought that there's nothing there. But Africa is a really rich, sound, intelligent community. I myself have been 3 times. And so in getting to interact with the individuals that I've interacted with, I think we come with this sort of Western ideal of being smarter or better or more advanced. We're actually very far behind as a society in terms of education and technology, especially when you compare to somewhere like Nigeria, that is, I believe, the 7th largest population in the world and have one of the fastest growing tech industries. The bulk of their demographics are under the age of 18. So we recognize, too, that the younger generation are who push the needle fastest. So with a country with that big of a young demographic, they'd be for sure someone you'd want to be paying attention to in terms of innovation. And then in terms of resiliency, you look at somewhere like Rwanda, who within one generation was able to turn around their entire country and have now become sort of a model for other countries looking to advance within that short of a time period. And so I think just more generally stating it, the misconceptions are around just intelligence, around richness of the earth, around safety. And a lot of that has been sort of doubled down on in our media. But if you're ever able to go yourself, first of all, let me know. I'll see if I can do anything to help. But if anyone's ever able to go there themselves, I think doing the research. And then once you get there, you'll see what a rich, beautiful, growing, thriving continent Africa is.
I think that's really, really well put and really powerfully said. So thank you for doing that. Um, so tell me what excites you most about what you get to do on a daily basis. Obviously, your job's probably not easy. I would guess you are probably juggling a lot. So what excites you and what gets you out of bed in the morning?
I get excited by leaving this world in a better place than how I found it. That's sort of my guiding star. I think, sort of as the tier below that, if you're funneling down into execution, a major cornerstone for that is liberation for Black people. So whether that's from an education perspective, whether that's from a fiscal perspective, whether that's from, in some of my other work, a criminal justice or legal perspective, all of that marries into each other. And anytime I find myself in a unique space that's brought a creative idea to the forefront, I'm just so motivated by that. And this is one of those that I think the scale and the opportunity is so large. Again, recognizing that for consumers, there's the opportunity to make sort of healthier micro choices. And then from the company or larger corporation side, there's the opportunity to leave a stronger impact without, again, having to affect your bottom line. And so that all sounds like a win-win to me. And anytime that I can impact other people for the betterment of society at large, I'm super jazzed about.
I love that. I love that. So Chelsea, as we wrap up our conversation here today, is there anything you want to leave people with? Any, words of wisdom, thoughts, just general, either summary of our conversation or anything that's on your mind that you think that people need to know, whether it's from a consumer perspective, a business perspective, anything along those lines. Kind of the floor is yours for anything you want listeners to walk away with from having heard this podcast.
I think anyone listening to this podcast is probably a different perspective that they've heard in this space. And so we could come off as very disruptive. But I think what we're most looking to do is to build bridges, not borders, between how organizations and consumers are working in tandem or working within their separate spheres. And so what I want people to take away from this is that change doesn't have to be hard, it doesn't have to be ugly, and that it can be progressive and fruitful. And so I look forward to finding ways to support anyone listening to this. If there are opportunities for us to source for you, if there's opportunities, if you're a small business, for us to be able to supply you, if there's opportunities from a resource sharing perspective for any organizations looking to learn more, we're happy and willing to continue to bridge this gap.
That's really well put. Chelsea, how can people get in touch if they want to learn more about either eye to eye or get in touch with you and ask questions? What's the best way for people to go about doing that?
I think email works perfect. So if anyone wants to email me at chelsea@eyeglobal.com, it's CHELSEA at EYETOEYEGLOBAL.com. And so again, we're open and willing to support any communities that we can, any organizations, any corporations, from the full gamut of the supply chain, looking to enhance just the ethical treatment of people across the globe.
Excellent stuff. Dr. Chelsea Heyward, Director of Marketing and U.S. Relations at Eye to Eye Global. Chelsea, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And everyone, thank you for tuning into this episode of Careers on the Move, a podcast brought to you by Cargomatic. It's been a pleasure having you all along with us for this episode of the show. Make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts these days to stay up to date with the latest from Cargomatic. And stay tuned. We'll be back soon with new episodes of the show. But for my guest today, Dr. Chelsea Heyward, I've been your host, Tyler Kern. Thanks for joining us.